Okay, so out of all the Pokemon theory videos I have ever made that were based on some kind of like rational thinking, so I don't think they're just theories, but this is probably going to be the hardest and most confusing one to really explain. Okay, so out of all the Pokemon games, and there's always been this theory that Kangaskhan, Cubone, and Marowak were always like connected somehow, but for the longest time, nobody could really understand like how to really look at it. I think the hardest question to figure out was always trying to figure out how the hell do you go from like baby Kangaskhan, Cubone, Marowak, and then Kangaskhan, the adult Kangaskhan? And I figured it out finally. So, in the final version of Pokemon, there were supposed to be like 5 evolutions, from what I understand, but 2 of them were kind of split off, sort of. One of them would be like, you'd have like a baby Kangaskhan. You would have Kangaskhan itself. So yeah, baby Kangaskhan, and then it would be like Cubone, Marowak, Guardia. There was like 5 different evolutions or something like that. But what's really interesting, though, is this is what I found out recently. Guardia was actually cut over to be Kangaskhan, so that's why they scrapped Guardia. So, yes, Kangaskhan and Cubone are still the same family, but how this makes sense, though, this is where it gets confusing, because what happens is, this is what you really got to think about. Kangaskhan was the second drawn Pokemon, right next to Rhydon in the original 191 index numbers. So what happened was they decided to take Kangaskhan. It became a foster parent for Cubone. And, well, this is where it's going to get confusing. And this is what we're going to try to explain in this video. Okay, so Kangaskhan is a kind of like based on the old legend of Genghis Khan, which is a real emperor in Asia somewhere. I forget exactly where at. But basically, he united a bunch of people, and he fought a lot of wars, too, to help people out. And he divided and conquered, too, but, basically he did it just to make progress. And so his people looked at him like he was a hero because he gave back to them somehow. And you kind of get Kangaskhan is kind of like the same thing. It's a parody of Genghis Khan in the sense that it's like a foster parent. It adopts Pokemon. It takes care of them. So Kangaskhan obviously being a mother, and if I remember correctly, there's no such thing as a male Kangaskhan. Here's where it gets interesting though. So, and this is where it's going to get really confusing, because this is how I see it as it. I think that Marowak, Kangaskhan, baby Kangaskhan, even if you can't catch a baby Kangaskhan in the game, and besides the story elements of Pokemon, as well as Marowak, I think that Cubone and Kangaskhan are still part of the same family, and because they all seem like they're kangaroos, at least Kangaskhan is anyways. Now Marowak, it could still technically be a Kangaskhan and a kangaroo, because it's grown up. But here's where it gets interesting. So in the storyline, again, if you remember Lavender Town, Team Rocket killed Cubone's mother. So it was confirmed that, yes, Kangaskhan was like a foster parent for Cubone, but it wasn't its real mother. And then you had some people say, well, what about Cubone's mother? Cubone Marowak, female Marowak, obviously. So you're saying that we could technically have, like, Cubone could have, like, 2 parents, sort of? And some people thought that was impossible, but it actually kind of makes sense if you think about it. Marowak, see, I think it's true to say, because again, the proof is like this. Cubone, it's hard to tell what Cubone looks like because it refuses. You can never see it take off its skull. It refuses to take it off, and then when it evolves into Marowak, it obviously becomes its skull. So, yeah. But this is what's really interesting, though. If you think about it, Kangaskhan is, the male, the Cubones are basically a baby Kangaskhan. And I think that's why they scrapped the evolutionary line for it. Cubone would basically be, it's still a baby Kangaskhan because you can tell by its stomach lining and all that. And if anybody thinks it's like a baby Charmander, that's not true. There, some people still think like Charmander. Charmander's a flame lizard, and Cubone is basically a ground type bone collector, and it's a kangaroo sort of, but without a pouch though, and it's young, very young. Guardia also was kind of like a kangaroo bone collector, a ground type, and it cared for the Cubone. See, what I think happened was when Guardia was, you would have Cubone, Marowak, and then Guardia, and then it would just have Cubones, and then it would take care of the young again. But then the story changed, and basically, so now we have this concept of, where do they get all these baby Cubones without the bones on their head? Maybe the story was a little bit different at one point. But this is how I look at it, though. So this is basically what we have. I think it makes a lot of sense to say that it's kind of like a combination of like Marowaks breed with female Kangaskans, and they have children. The children can either be two different Cubones or a baby Kangaskhan. The baby Kangaskhan there can actually, like maybe not in the games, can actually evolve into different things. One could become a Kangaskhan if the conditions are met, or maybe it becomes a Cubone somehow, and then its mother dies, wears its skull on its head, and then at some point maybe becomes a Marowak, and then maybe evolves into another. Maybe it could evolve into Kangaskhan at some point. Because here's the thing. With Pokemon evolutions, anything's possible. It's possible that, even a Cubone, even a Marowak, a female Marowak, let's say, somehow it could be a female Marowak, and then it could evolve into Kangaskhan, even though, again, not in the games, but it could technically look a little bit different. Or maybe, maybe that part wasn't true, and so once it became a Marowak, the Marowak was obviously a different kind of Kangaskhan, a different kind of fox Pokemon, or a kangaroo, not fox, but a kangaroo. And so you get the split timeline rather, where baby Kangaskhan, so all baby Kangaskhan's can be Cubones to Marowaks, or just straight up a female to maybe even a female Kangaskhan. Because every time a Pokemon evolves, its evolutionary design changes, its physical appearance. And I do think that it is very possible Cubone, the baby Kangaskhan's always had two parents, either whether it was because of Marowak or it was because of Kangaskhan itself. Kangaskhan, I think the hardest part is trying to figure out, like, how do you get another Kangaskhan? Because Kangaskhan is always like its own Pokemon with a child, But I think really what it was that I think that would make more sense that Marowaks could evolve into Kangaskhan's maybe at some point, because the problem was Kangaskhan was eventually Guardia at one point, so it eventually became its own evolution. It basically, like, they cut off the evolutionary line for Marowak, and they just said, you know what, Kangaskhan is the final evolution, but it's a separate timeline though. So now you basically, it would kind of make sense that that's how you should really look at it. Even though, again, the games, I think Game Freak did it because they wanted it to, I think, and this is why people for the longest time think it's kind of like a contradiction. Maybe Game Freak screwed up something, but I think it kind of does make sense when you think about it. They wanted they wanted it to be a play on words, that it was based on Kangaskhan being a foster parent. So it's like a second child for a second mother, because it's always female for all the Cubones. But here's something else to think about. All Cubones, all Kangaskhan's, all, Marowaks, they're almost like loners. They don't really travel in tribes for the most part, unless you count them doing like strange rituals in a graveyard. See, a lot of people have to understand that as adorable as Cubone and Kangaskhan are, they kind of belong to like one of the more fucked up sort of designs, like dark history of Pokemon. And it's just the way it is, They're out in a graveyard, they're out in they wear their mother's dead skull. I mean, that's kind of scary when you think about it, but it's like, it's really close to its parents and it couldn't let them go. It uses its own bones to fight things. It's very interesting how they came up with that concept. Heck, you could even find, Cubones in lavender towns, like even without the Silph Scope, you'd find their ghosts and everything. And that's really screwed up when you think about it. But no, I definitely do think that Guardia was Kangaskhan. They scrapped it. And then they decided that Marowak could eventually kind of be connected to Kangaskhan's. They do breed, and you get baby Kangaskhan's. So Cubone is a baby Kangaskhan based on its looks and all that. And there was multiple ways they could either become a Marowak or said Kangaskhan. Not just maybe in the games themselves, but the lore of Pokemon, like how it worked in the Pokemon universe. Because it's very interesting when you think about it, that Kangaskhan is like a brown Pokemon, and when you look at like all the other Pokemon, that's probably what they figured. And I think that's why they also scrap Orphan, or the baby Kangaskhan missing though, which was index number 135 originally out of 191. I think that's why they scrapped it, because they probably figured, well, Cubone's already a baby Kangaskhan with a skull on its head. So they probably already had the baby Kangaskhan, and they just decided to turn it into Cubone instead. So do I think that Nintendo kind of goofed up and like left certain things out of Game Freak? No, I think really what they did was, it's just like we don't see the whole story, but it is there though. You know, I do think they still could figure it out. It's just kind of confusing, because it's like, you know, Marowaks don't directly evolve into Kangaskhan, and we don't really see like a younger Kangaskhan besides the baby, you know. And for the longest time, Cubone was like that young Pokemon, but we don't see Cubone, you know. So at some point, you know, Kangaskhan and Marowak had to breed at some point. And I mean, yeah, you can still get female Marowaks, no doubt. And those Pokemon would most definitely be, they still get Cubones. But at the same time, though, yes, it does make sense that Kangaskhan is like a foster parent, but at the same time, the real mother was definitely Marowak, though, because that's what we've seen over the years. And not only that, but, you know, Kangaskhan was a foster parent that basically watched over. So they if you think about it, Kangaskhan's and Marowaks got along very well, and they probably breeded a lot, and that's where they got their children from. They just watched over them. And Kangaskhan was a very good Pokemon, you know, so they most definitely were, you know, they breeded a lot, but at the same time, though, Kangaskhan's were kind of, I mean, as rare as they were to find, they were also, you know, they did their part in raising their own young, too. So they were a part of it somehow. Whether giving birth or just residing over somebody else's. So I definitely do think that's the easiest way to explain it, because as far as the Pokemon trilogy goes, there's just multiple ways to look at these things. You have the series itself, where it states that there's just different things Pokemon can do, and there's different evolutionary types and different ways they can get to that point. Again, you know, like you want a more like complicated one or more simplified one, but what I'm getting at, look at Eevee, for example. The idea is that it evolves in a different Pokemon, and you just give it a different stone and it evolves in a different Pokemon, or you take a different approach. But, you know, then you got some Pokemon that are like related to each other, but they're different species though. So it's kind of, or every time like Ditto breeds with a different Pokemon, it changes its molecular structure. But you can kind of see what I'm getting at though. So because of that concept, that explains why they should be able to, you know, do what they do. You know, so again, I think it makes sense that Cubone and then Marowak were somewhat related to Kangaskhan, because they were not only the same Pokemon, sort of, but at the same time, though, they just had different genetics that got them to where they were at. Kangaskhan's could be baby Kangaskhan's adult form, and then, you know, they could take a different approach too, where like they could become a Cubone because they were watching over somebody else's parent. That parent, the real parent, died, and it was adopted by Kangaskhan, but you don't see it with the mother skull until later on, and then by then, so it's like, even though we don't see like a Kangaskhan with a Cubone, but it's like that Cubone could very well be a Marowak as well once it later on. Because like the Dexter entry states, you know, Cubone's lonely. It doesn't, but once it grows up though, it becomes, it throws all that aside, and now it becomes like a ferocious, you know, it just manned up, basically, became a completely different Pokemon, and it evolved differently. So interesting to think about. So interesting how evolutions affect the Pokemon, but it affects their history, their lore, and their nature altogether. So again, if you're not subscribed already, tell me what you think. But I think this is probably like one of the best solutions to like probably one of the most confusing and complex stories that most people to this day had no idea. Because Pokemon, we have always tried to figure this out, and it's impressive that anybody was even able to put this together somehow. That you could take two different Pokemon that didn't even look like they had anything to do with each other, and they did this whole time. So there you go.